Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Just starting with a bit of housekeeping, this is a 1-hour session. We have a Q&A box available. I think we've got approximately 100 attendees, and we will have a few polls probably early in the session just to get an indication from you of your indication interest. The recording will be shared afterwards. I'm John Matthews. I'm Chief Medical Officer at Rico Therapeutics. Been at Rico for about 3 years. I'm a pulmonologist by training, and I've been involved in respiratory clinical trials for over 25 years now. I have to admit, I've never been assigned author of an active live COPD protocol, but I've certainly followed with interest, and we have a lot of experts here. So my role is moderating today. I would say that there are multiple biologics approved now for asthma. Obviously, the focus is for severe asthma, and we're starting to see efficacy and approval now of biologics in COPD, which is really exciting. But symptomatology and gaining claims around symptom improvement has been extraordinarily hard, but we're making some progress. And there are a number of reasons for this, and that's why we're here today. And we've got an extraordinary opportunity, I think, a rare opportunity of having a collection of experts to bring in the patient perspective, the clinical academic perspective, the person that sees patients in the clinic, the pharma representative who runs and manages clinical trials, our access and our payer perspective, a respiratory therapist to understand how we can actually get some of the key data that we need with the measurements that we can do in the lung, and our operational excellence person, how we can actually run these trials and get them done on time and on budget. So I'm going to allow the panel to introduce themselves, starting with Dr. John Hurst, and we'll run through left to right. So over to you, John.
Thanks, John. Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And I'm John Hurst. I'm an academic pulmonologist. I work in London in the UK. My research is based at University College London, and I still see patients in North London, in Camden, in our secondary care and community healthcare services. I've been involved with biologic trials for COPD. I guess we might be talking about that a little bit later, and looking forward to the discussion and your questions. Thanks very much, John.
Hi, John. This is Joanne Fletcher. I was at GSK for 15 years across R&D and medical affairs, including respiratory biologics. I recently started at Generate Bio, so I bring a pharma sponsor perspective to this panel.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is
Andrew.
My name is Andrew Knoyer. I'm with an organization called Precision AQ, and I'll be representing the payer and market access perspective. I've been in managed care for over 25 years. I'm a pharmacist by training. I've done formulary work across regional and national health plans in the US, Tufts Health Plan, Cigna, and Aetna. I've been a former head of formulary and utilization management for Medicare line of business. In that role as a head decision maker, and wrote the drug formularies for 2.5 million members across 6 regions in the US, responsible for clinical, financial, quality, performance. So here I lead a team of former payer experts that we support commercialization and market access strategies.
I'm Malcolm.
Hi. Oh, I'm Jose Ramos.
Sorry, Jose.
That's okay. I'm Jose Ramos. I'm a respiratory therapist, director of IDN and clinical trials for Monitor Therapeutics, which is a remote healthcare solution in the respiratory space. Spent majority of my career at Cleveland Clinic, left there as a director of the pulmonary function labs for the enterprise, got into the clinical trial space. During my time at the clinic, I also performed clinical trial testing, so giving both sides of the perspective, and I'll be talking a little bit about remote monitoring and how we can get that to be a good correlation or match with what's going on and being collected in clinic as well.
Hello everyone, my name is Malcolm Fogarty. I'm the head of strategic partnerships at Lindus Health, formerly a client at GSK and Haleon, the consumer health spin out from GSK. My role at Lindus Health is helping our pharma and biotech customers design, run much more efficient and faster clinical trials and studies. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, panelists. So we're going to kick off with a discussion from the panel first, and then we'll do a poll afterwards to see where our audience has a specific therapeutic interest. We have focused this discussion, we think, to start with on obstructive airways diseases. With severe asthma, obviously, there have been multiple biologics approved, and there's somewhat of a convergence of the efficacy data. The COPD landscape is obviously evolving, and we're starting to see biologics gaining some certainly approval and certainly gaining therapeutic use. So as we go through a number of targets showing similar efficacy, what we want to do is have a discussion really around what we're calling the convergence problem. So I'm going to ask John to kick us off, giving the sort of the patient and the clinician perspective around how we can look at this problem, and the aim is to try and find better ways of doing trials to get to what the patients want to see benefit from, and what the payers will reimburse for.
Thank you, John. It's a really interesting question, isn't it? I'm interested to hear what others think about this too. And I guess part of the convergence problem may be that we're all chasing the same endpoints. So the endpoints that we're using in clinical trials are often the same for very good reason. Either they are endpoints that are recognized by regulatory bodies, or as a clinician to me, more importantly sometimes, endpoints that are important to my patients. So lung function being one of the first, exacerbations being one of the second, for example. And so part of this convergence may be the fact that we've been doing trials in the same way, trying to look at the same things. Start to unpick it though, and I'm speaking now from a COPD perspective, which is where my own expertise lies, and you can see differences in recruitment criteria, in inclusions, in exclusions, and in how specific endpoints are measured, which actually might start to mean that there is the opportunity to differentiate between different biologics. So I guess I'm coming at this with a degree of optimism. Maybe I'll throw this out there and see where that lands us.
Let's move to Andrew from the payer perspective around where we are with this sort of, maybe we focus on severe asthma in terms of how we're doing.
I think from a payer perspective, the general oversight or perspective may be that there's not a ton of unmet need. And they probably feel that with the current armamentarium of products on the market today, ranging from inhaler therapies up to triple, and with some biologic advanced therapies, that they have it covered in their treatment options along the various genus stages, if you will. With that being said, I think there's a significant lack of understanding on asthma and what true beneficial outcomes should look like, what asthma control looks like, and how that ultimately translates to downstream outcomes that are meaningful to payers, which really typically revolve around exacerbations. It's exacerbations that have the direct medical costs. So I think there's an opportunity here, really from understanding the unmet needs that currently exist in the current treatments. With that said, the pipeline is huge here. So we see multiple mechanisms of action across 50 plus different products that are ranging from phase 1 up to phase 3, and a lot of evolution there. So when we look at that pipeline, coupled with what we perceive as maybe not so much unmet need, there's a need for understanding how each one of these are actually going to play in the market and for the specific patient populations they're going to treat.
Great.
I think another point to look at it from my side of view with the remote monitoring and where that's come from, where it was started at, is being able to see the peaks and valleys in order to help the payers out to distinguish whether, these medications that are coming are helping patients, but again, are they having peaks and valleys throughout their visits, right? Because we're getting a snapshot. We don't necessarily get a video thread throughout their time.
Thanks, Jose. Yeah, no, I mean, I think trials obviously are set by somewhat visit blocks, which, you know, somewhat monthly, but there's a lot of time about how we collect data, and sometimes when we ask patients to do like a twice daily diary, you know, for a 1 year phase 3 trial, it's a lot of snapshots, but what are we actually capturing? In severe asthma, I think there's a move to get to definitions of remission. Perhaps that's another discussion around how we, is there an ability to reimburse for a remission status? Is that the way we should be going, or should we be trying to focus more on symptoms and how patients feel, irrespective of where they are in their GINA or their stage in their disease? But I'd like to bring Joanne in because to get a pharma perspective.
I guess from a pharma perspective, you know, we are held really closely to what the regulators want. And I think, you know, what that means sometimes is we are designing clinical trials for very specific endpoints without really being able to consider how a patient might really behave in the real world. In a clinical trial, patients have either daily monitoring for various patient-reported outcomes. They may have weekly visits or monthly visits, and that isn't normal standard of care. So does those trial behaviors cause a different behavior in the patients in that very trial-focused environment than John might perhaps experience in his clinic? So beyond the existing phase 3 trials, what can people, you know, like you guys do to understand how those treatments are really used in the real world? What happens, you know, post phase 3 trial when the drugs are being used, when they're approved and being used by doctors and healthcare professionals, and how can you see what the difference is between some of those medicines in the real world, and what might that look like?
Totally. I think that you're bringing up a very, very interesting set of problems around trial design. The regulators set us to do things in ways which we try and optimize for success. So say FEV1, it's a primary endpoint that comes first, and there's a hierarchy that means by definition symptoms are lower down the hierarchy. But I think there have been some innovative attempts to do trials more in the real world. I think there was a very landmark trial with tokenization using patients' NHS data that allow people to be dispensed in a pharmacy in their community and followed with endpoints pulled from their medical record. So I guess, John, over to you. How can we do what Joanne is proposing is to get, even if it's not in a pivotal trial, but more in a phase 4 supportive trial, how can we get closer to what actually is important for patients and actually show where the benefits might or might not be happening?
Thanks, John. And Joanne makes great points. I mean, a couple of reflections on that. First of all, the challenge of recruiting to a standard phase 3 randomized controlled trial from my clinic in London. Nearly everybody I see has a comorbidity or a social problem that means that they are almost always ineligible for these pivotal studies that lead to the registration. That's not to say that these studies aren't important. Of course they are, but they do not reflect the target population often where people are going to be using those drugs in clinical practice, be that in secondary care or primary care. And so what we're starting to talk about, and I think the community are moving towards as well, is an understanding that real-world evidence studies, registry studies, post-marketing studies, actually are adding a level of evidence that is very, very complementary, is actually much more reflective of what's going on in clinical practice in the original registration study. So I do see these being used more and more, and I would see that they are complementary. From an RCT point of view, I think collecting outcome data that are relevant to patients and clinicians, as well as just the ones that are important to regulators, is kind of a way to sort of bridge that gap as well. So from a COPD perspective, functional measures, symptoms, and exacerbations, of course, which are at least an accepted endpoint by regulators.
Thanks, John. I think we're going to do a quick poll now. There'll be two polls. It's going to ask, what's your primary function? This is to reach out to our audience. And then what is your focus indication? Just so we can get a sense of the panel of if this obstructive focus is going to be useful for you early in the discussion. So that poll should be closed. I don't know if we can share back the results.
Yeah, so I can see here, John, we've got large percentage clinical development, clinical ops, medical flares coming in, medical, clinical science, HUR. I think we've got everybody in at this stage.
Brilliant. And let's do the second one. What's your focus indication? I think you can add more than one.
It was 100% COPD there, but then I just realized that I answered super quick.
Looks like COPD is taking top billings, followed by asthma, bronchiectasis, other, and IPF.
Great. Okay, let's keep going. I think we can bring in some points around bronchiectasis and IPF and other lung diseases later. But let's keep on the obstructive focus. I'm going to move on just to this next slide to help us focus the discussion more on the evidence gap. So there's this first part, what do the evidence dossiers that we have typically include to get an approval? And then what are the payers and providers looking for? So I guess, Joanne, perhaps you could kick us off with what are we typically focused on, and why don't we start with COPD, given this is a top focus?
I think that, the criteria that we're looking for from a regulatory perspective are quite standard. So it's FEV1, it is exacerbations, it is PROs. But I think, most of the biologic therapies have, very similar primary and secondary endpoints. And I think what, payers and, I'll bring in you, Andrew, as the expert on this, but I suppose, what payers and particularly people who use the medicines are looking for is, how is your medicine different from the ones that are already on the market? So, all very similar results across lung function and exacerbations, but what will that mean for me in my clinic, and how will it benefit my patients?
I would agree with that, Joanne. From the payer lens, we also think the crown jewel for us is really looking at the exacerbations, because we can make a clear correlation to the direct medical costs associated with that. But I think what I've learned around exacerbations, especially in asthma, but also in COPD, is not every exacerbation necessarily leads to a high cost ER visit or hospitalization. And those many exacerbations, there's lung damage done along the way. So I think understanding exacerbations a little bit more deeply to understand different patient populations will be one area that will be meaningful to payers. The other piece, which is hard to do in a clinical setting, is to really demonstrate durability of effect. Certainly most trials run the range from 24, 48 weeks. And what we're really looking for is, how can you sustain a clinical benefit over time? And I think that's where that supplemental evidence, real world evidence, comes into play to help kind of close that gap.
And if I can come in there, maybe. So I agree with Andrew. And of course, the highest cost of all is going to be for hospitalized COPD exacerbations. But then we have the challenge that COPD is quite a heterogeneous condition. And the causes of exacerbations add an extra level of heterogeneity on top of that. So your exacerbation could be bacterial or viral or something different. And your COPD could be emphysema predominant or bronchitis predominant. And so asking a single biologic drug designed specifically to interfere in a specific pathway at a specific point to prevent all of those is a really, really big ask. And so making the case around the finance for severe, meaning hospitalized exacerbations, is super, super tricky.
Certainly, very, very tricky. So there's a focus on exacerbation events, but there's a range of severities in COPD, and so preventing, the hospitalization, which is a big cost driver, versus say a patient who may be more interested in the fact that they bring up mucus every morning and they're breathless and they can't get to the shops holding their shopping bags. How should we be thinking about what the evidence gap is, and how do we collect this data?
Well, I'm actually intrigued by that, John. So I think a lot of the focus in COPD biologics has been demonstrating reduction of exacerbations because of the cost. But then I look at other areas of medicine where biologics have totally transformed the therapeutic landscape, without a question of a doubt. Inflammatory arthritis, atopic skin conditions, inflammatory bowel disease, for example. And so how have those specialty areas made the case for high-cost drugs when they don't have frequent exacerbations? What can we learn from those other disease settings? I think sometimes in respiratory, and I don't mean industry and payer colleagues, because you're doing this all of the time, I think, but as clinicians anyway, we're often very siloed. And I think we have the opportunity to learn a lot by thinking about how other specialists have made the case in their disease areas for these kind of interventions.
Yeah, I somewhat think of it in terms of COPD. There's the progression of the disease means there's a lot of irreversibility, whereas in asthma, the reversibility component, I think, allowed the biologics to gain a lot of traction. Whereas in COPD, I think it'd be good to discuss how we could intervene earlier in COPD in a way that, John, you're referring to other diseases where it's more of a prevention. And so would the payers be willing to pay for early interventions in COPD where perhaps the claim isn't around exacerbation or hospitalization, but trying to prevent progression of the disease? Maybe Andrew, how is this something that you think that payers would be willing to reimburse for?
I do think directionally, yes, it is what payers do reimburse for, as John had mentioned, but where we ultimately need to better understand is kind of that patient journey that's happening at the earlier stages in COPD and in asthma, and what control actually looks like in how maintaining a certain level of disease control without progressing to later stages of disease or more advanced disease that requires more costly interventions. I think ultimately we want to see like how that easy button can be pushed with a more advanced therapy. It could be biologic, it could be other small molecule. Nonetheless, we want to see how it maintains a person in a specific, how long they can maintain a lower level of disease, and therefore avert certain downstream complications which are more costly. One of the storylines that kind of comes into play is if we don't treat earlier or more aggressively with an advanced therapy, by the time they progress, now we have an even more sicker, more difficult, and more costly patient that we treat. So I think that has to come through. What complicates it is certainly advanced therapies are very expensive. So What we offset is typically we're investing more upfront. So I think that's really the conundrum that comes into play. At the end of the day, though, we are looking for things that are modifying disease and driving a better patient outcome that ultimately has a direct medical cost offset to it.
That's music to my ears. I'm so excited to hear that. I have to jump on that, Andrew. You've made my day. It sort of also starts to speak to the question maybe about why biologics don't work better in COPD. And actually, I think, again, that comparison with maybe inflammatory arthritis is really useful and informative. So in inflammatory arthritis, you're going in early when there's active synovitis. You're going in before permanent joint destruction, and you're going into a sterile space. And if you think about what's happening in the lung in COPD, we're not going in until much later when there's advanced lung destruction in a lung which is open to the air and has an altered microbiome. And in a patient who's older and usually smoked and therefore prone to comorbidities like cancer, it's a totally different thing. So this paradigm that we go in early and stop the patient getting so bad that they need even higher cost interventions in the future, got to be good for the system and got to be good for patients too. So it's a conversation I think that is starting to happen in the respiratory community, and I really hope it continues. It has to be the way forward.
I appreciate that, John. I think the one thing that, unlike, say, arthritis, where some of those drugs used there are really dinosaurs and not the best treatment options when you're looking at, say, methotrexate and other immunosuppressant type of drugs. I think here what we need to really demonstrate is the incremental benefit of advanced therapies over the inhaled therapies, which at the end of the day are simple and cheap. And they're guideline back too. So I think that's where we have to ultimately move the needle with the evidence is showing the incremental improvement over the current standards of care. To get that I'm sorry, John.
Yeah. No, thank you. So we're about to go into a bit more of a focus on, I think, spirometry and some specific data that we've got around spirometry and how we can do that remotely. But before we get there, just John, if you could help us just understand COPD symptomatology in a standard phase 3 clinical trial. I think St. George's questionnaire. Is there anything you'd like to give us a beyond spirometry? What is it that we would be collecting typically, and can we build in better ways of doing that?
Two questions there, John, right? Two questions in one. You've gone for a special offer with that. So there's what do we measure and how do we measure it? And those two things are both important. And I think that we've talked a lot about lung function. We're going to talk about that a bit more. Exacerbations is another one, but how do you capture those? Do you go with a daily diary tool, for example, or are you reliant on people using courses of oral corticosteroids and antibiotics? Joanne mentioned PROs in COPD. We have the SGRQ, of course, a beast of a questionnaire, and the CAAT, which at least is shorter. But then actually, I've yet to see a patient in clinic who's complained about their CAT score or their FEV1. They do complain about their exacerbations, but what they often complain about is what they can't do. And so I do think that we might be underusing performance tests, if you like. So 6-minute walk, incremental shuttle walk, for example, as things which are important to patients in terms of how much they can do. And then now that everybody has a smartwatch where I work, maybe we have activity monitoring and other ways to do. So I think we can be smarter about what we measure, because with the changes in technology, we are definitely smarter about how we can measure it. And so we need to join those two things up.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I think we have these long or demanding patient diaries. But I think, we need to have some innovative ways of collecting more. Maybe the smart wristband or the watch or the ring might be a way to do that. I think there's actigraphy gained some traction, and perhaps that's still being worked up to gain how we can get a score for how well people are actually functioning and quantify that. I'm going to move us on to this next topic, which is really around remote diagnostics and data confidence. There's two big numbers here. I think we've synthesized. So I'm going to ask Jose to give us some background around where we we got to these numbers, why we're flagging them here, and then John to give us a perspective on how he thinks how we define the spirometry that is going to be useful, and whether we can start to move away from brick and mortar sites and have more remote trials for respiratory.
I think the first thing we have to touch on is that 98% one, and remember that when we do research, it doesn't carry the same weight of testing as it does when you're at a clinical site, right? At a clinical site, you have pulmonary function technologists, you have people who have been trained to do pulmonary function testing, spirometry specifically, as we're speaking here. But in clinical trials, you're able to have a research coordinator, somebody who does 12 other jobs performing the testing. And while they get training to a certain extent, they also are not familiar with all the start and end of test criteria. There is information about, did you get the first limb of spirometry, the second, the third, the fourth, as there's 4 different phases that going on. But capturing that immediate feedback to not only train the end user, but also the patient in front of you, to make sure that they're getting the testing correctly, so you don't have to repeat and have additional visits that cost more to the study as they're coming on. So we've been able to work through this with some avatar coaching, and it's not about coaching the patient through the maneuver, but it's what they do after it's all done, and giving that instantaneous feedback to help improve quality. If you're doing a great test, great, let's make sure we all know it's great testing. But then you talk about the criteria of acceptability and repeatability, the 150 mLs that it needs to be within, where it's easy to look at a loop and say, oh, that looks great. But unless you know what the numbers are telling you, you may move forward before knowing what actually needs to be done with this patient. Their first effort is usually the worst one, and not meaning they did a terrible job at the test, meaning their lungs weren't awake and fully open when they're doing that first test. So that can cause their numbers to be so much lower than what they are. And they can grow a little bit more, maybe get 170, 200, 250 mLs larger. Then you have to worry about that repeatability matching up versus, oh, that looks like a good curve to me. We're going to move forward and move to the next test. In the other report, we are looking at the reproducibility between what can be done in clinic with a human being versus what can be done in home. So one of the things we recommend is making sure you have that reproducibility between what the site is using at their site there versus what they're using at home, and make sure those 2 devices correlate. And so with the study we've done here, we're able to show that we had a very tight connection between the 2 and didn't allow it to strain out. So what you're seeing in home is what you're seeing in clinic, and patients know what to shoot and strive for as they're going through with their testing.
Thanks, Jose. So John, perhaps, this is, how do you see it as a clinician around spirometry, and where we can move away from the demand of a patient coming in every month to a site and have the confidence of the data that we're collecting at their home remotely?
Yeah, I'm persuaded by the data that Jose's presented. I think it's not for everybody, right? So not all patients are able to do this, but I think with live AI overread, at least, as well as being able to support a patient to do the test as well as possible with the coaching, we also know at the time whether it's met quality criteria. So part of this has been solved technologically, and this might be particularly important in trials of in IPF, as you have on the slide there. Not so much of a big thing for COPD, I don't think. And I guess, of course, a lot of the other trials, you're wanting to do other things with the patient at those visits as well. So once a month might be somebody coming up for dosing, and you can do the spirometry on site. So I personally, in a COPD perspective, I don't see remote home spirometry as a panacea for future COPD trials. I'm more interested in other endpoints, and we often want to do other things as well. So works for some and works for some indications, but it's not the solution to everybody's problem.
Yeah,
I think when you look at some of the longer acting biologics, if their clinical trials have less frequent visits, and you're having spirometry maybe once or twice a year, that is a very small snapshot of that patient's life over the year. If they're using remote home spirometry, you could have multiple spirometry readings that give a bit more of a flavor of their behavior day in, day out, and whether, you know, the impact of the medicine is having a more significant impact on their lung function over time.
I agree with you, Joanne. And where I see it beneficial in COPD patients is capturing that FEV1 is an important number, but capturing that FEV1 means you have to have a good FVC. Just as if you sent somebody home with a peak flow meter, if they take a half breath in, they're only going to have half the peak flow. So getting the spirometry gives you full confirmation that this patient is having an exacerbation versus them just giving a weak effort and making that number look lower than what it was. Today, I don't feel like it, versus when you have set criteria, we know if they didn't go to their full capabilities of testing and giving that patient some ownership, making them part of their research team, not perhaps a captain, but a significant player, can help you identify that, again, the FEV1 is real and it's not lack of effort that goes on to. Along with the questions, I believe we should have subjective and objective data, so we should be having questionnaires right along with that as well. And I think the CAT-8, as you mentioned, is a good source versus the lengthy St. George as we go through. Definitely beneficial, but in a short turnaround time.
I'm encouraged that we are pushing the boundary about doing trials that are fully remote. John, I would challenge you around the idea that just because it's a biologic that needs to be in clinic, I think we've had the comfort of bringing people in monthly, but I think certainly at Recode, we've had a movement where we've been able to go and have at-home dosing. It's observed, they have safety monitoring for an hour with a qualified nurse, but we bring the therapeutic to the patient. And so I think we should have an open mind around how we do trials, and as we'll come to the next set of discussion around how we can design trials that differentiate. I think there's an aspect of safety, but as long as we can take the drug to the patient, particularly with these longer acting where it's a quarterly dosing, patients really do not want to come in and do lots of journey time, and we need I think to bring trials to the patient. That's a thrust that hopefully will happen. But the excitement is this AI avatar coaching. We've probably got to do some work to be confident that a online respiratory therapist with like video contact watch the effort versus some sort of mathematical collection of numbers, albeit by a very sophisticated system, is going to allow us to have confidence in the data. I think overreading by definition is somewhat cherry picking, and we try and be objective and we try and make sure that we are doing it in a good way. But I think the movement here is can we have more remote approaches that are going to be less human intensive and perhaps allow us to test more people at lower cost, to have bigger breadth and collect more data, and then layering onto the spirometry, having apps to allow people to share their symptomatology in real time without the sort of fully burdened massive questionnaire that just might not have traction. I'm conscious of time. Yeah,
just to say, there's a question in here from Adrian. Are there examples where regulators and/or payors have accepted home spirometry measurements? I was wondering if that's one that somebody wants to take.
Andrew, perhaps could you take that about have payors, and then Joanne perhaps about regulatory acceptance of home.
I think with home monitoring, there is kind of some foundation already to build upon with continuous glucose monitoring. So it is being reimbursed. I would say that payer reimbursement, digital therapeutics, wearables is still not in its infancy, but it's not mature. And there's where it becomes challenging is when you have multiple products and you have to assess which ones you're going to reimburse for, which ones not to. how to reimburse for them. The coding gets a little bit messier with these, and how to evaluate them. All of that is still, I think, developing. Nonetheless, payers do have means for their medical coverage to cover these. I think something that Jose said early on in the conversation around seeing peaks and valleys of FEV, what we probably want to understand is, what, when they're in a valley, what does that lead to? What is the, kind of the patient profile at a peak or a valley look like, so that we can ultimately understand what the outcome is. And that kind of adds some credence to what the continuous monitoring would actually provide us from a value perspective.
John Matthews, I want to touch on something you had mentioned there about being able to see the results that are coming in from home. And that's an important aspect, because even though if we're collecting and it's at home and we can't see it, that's as good as 2 visits a month or 1 visit a month. But actually being able to see it, apply it, maybe even put in alarms in there to catch exacerbation is important. And so again, that's one of the things we do on our end as well. As it being a cloud-based system, it's not just being tested at home and then we'll look at it when you come in. No, these are all things you can act on immediately. So that way, as Joanne said with the biologics and that longitudinal looking at it, you need to be able to see if there were areas that were going on. And the more we can see it in real time, the better, versus being stretched out and still in between getting those random snapshots versus periodically throughout as you're asking them to perform.
And the regulatory acceptance, yeah, Joanne.
So I guess I don't know the answer, Adrian, but I don't believe there are any phase 3 studies that have used remote spirometry as an endpoint. I know that it has been used quite a few times in phase 4 studies. I think the robustness of spirometry as an endpoint is really around standard spirometry. I've seen some really excellent publications though where they've used remote spirometry to either predict an incoming exacerbation, which is incredibly valuable, or to show an improvement in patients over a prolonged use of various treatments. And I think, the more data we get, the more chances that remote spirometry would be considered a robust endpoint for a regulatory standpoint. I think, our growing confidence in using remote and passive endpoints for trials, it's not quite there yet, but it's certainly starting to move in the right direction.
Great, thanks, John. I think we're going to go to a poll now to ask, what is your biggest challenge in our audience in differentiating your respiratory asset beyond efficacy? And then we can move into a session on designing studies that differentiate. So you can see the vote, the options. It's a choice. I think it's starting to saturate there. Oh, it's still growing.
Looks like generate real world fast enough to stay competitive is taken the top, followed by building a value story that works across multiple stakeholders, followed by reaching representatives in the real world, and then understanding what endpoints payors and HTA bodies value most.
Brilliant. I'm not exactly sure what that distribution is, but yeah, it's sort of double for generating fast enough to stay competitive. So it seems like it's one thing to get a drug approved, but to generate the real world data faster enough to stay competitive, i.e. to gain use of your therapeutic in the clinic, doubles in importance for the other aspects. But we do still need to understand what endpoints payors and HTA bodies value most, building the story and reaching representative patient populations. So with that in mind from our audience, let's just, we've got 15 minutes left, so we're going to do a quick session on section on designing studies that differentiate. Perhaps we start with Joanne around clinical phase 3b/4, and then a comment on prospective real-world evidence, how we can design our studies better to achieve this, starting from the the pharma clinical position.
I think if we take some of the experiences from the inhaled respiratory world, so for example, when we moved from inhalers that were 2 puffs twice a day to inhalers that are 1 puff once a day, head to head in a highly controlled clinical trial, it's really difficult to separate the results between those 2 types of inhaler. But the truth is, we know that patients are not always 100% compliant. We know that patients have other comorbidities, other issues, and other things to deal with. And we know that in the real world, perhaps they don't take their inhalers every day. And so GSK designed a clinical trial called the Salford Lung Study. And what we were aware of is that clinical trials cover about 3% of the actual population, so a kind of unicorn population of respiratory patients. But what the Salford Lung Study enabled us to do was to look at patients, and it was a phase 3 randomized control trial, but not interfere with the way they live their lives. So there were no mandated study visits beyond randomization. There were safety checks, however. And I think what that enabled us to do, and it was, a first of its kind, it wasn't something that I'd done before, and I don't believe it's really something that's been done since, but it enabled the people who use the medicines to be able to see how it might work in the patients that they see before them. And I think, taking that lens and applying it to biologics, how will biologics be used in the real world? Will they be given in clinics? Will they be taken at home? Will they be, mandated compliance? How will they also take their inhaled medicines too, amongst the other comorbid medicines? And how will these really look like in the patients that will use them? And I think that's going to be really important data for biologics patients. And it will also possibly be very important data for reimbursement. I'd be interested from your perspective, John, what do you think, is missing from phase 3 studies, and what are the evidence gaps that you think that pharma and sponsors need to fill?
And that's John Hurst.
Oh, that's coming my way. Aha, okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess I completely agree with Joanne, and the Salford Lung Study is worth a read because it's a few years old now, but the design was hugely innovative and did try to do something different. So that's a New England paper from a while ago. I think we've talked about some of this before, I guess. So one is the concept that whilst I might read a registration phase 3 RCT, duplicate RCT, when I look at my patient population in clinic, it looks totally different, and so I'm extrapolating it. And so with the real world evidence, I am generating some confidence that the interventions I'm putting in are actually effective for the people I see in my daily life, and also with all the messiness that goes with that, their adherence, their concordance, their comorbidities. And so I think it's providing very, very, as we talked about earlier on, I think it's providing very, very complementary evidence. Sometimes I think they're seen as kind of done in sequence, or they seem to me that they're done in kind of series rather, and actually thinking about how you generate that real world evidence earlier, and so that's part of the planning process, I think could sometimes be done better.
That's the second time the Salford Lung Study has been mentioned. I was referring to it earlier with tokenization. I think that was how they were able to achieve a lot of the data collection through ethical consent to allow patients to be followed through with all of their data from primary through hospital data seamlessly collected. So we should probably put the reference, if anyone's actually not aware of that study, in the chat before we finish. I just want to turn to Andrew then around perhaps some payer reflections on designing studies that differentiate.
Yeah, thank you, John. Yeah, sometimes really the concept payor rationalized clinical trials comes up in our organization, and more or less are we creating endpoints that are ultimately going to result in organizations that provide access and pay for these medications. We've touched upon a few of them. I do think payors typically want to see comparative data, comparative effectiveness. And I know it's brought up earlier that there's certain challenges in having direct comparators built into trials. Where it comes from is we're really looking to see how a drug compares to a standard of care and moves the needle to get an incremental benefit. In the absence of that, payor will go and do their own indirect treatment comparisons, as non-scientific as it may be. Nonetheless, they use kind of the standards of care or existing market leaders as a benchmark in order to assess how the needle is moving forward. And I think that's why there's always a preference to have that built into a trial where it is a controlled setting, and that ultimately has more credence than what I'm doing on the, we'll call it my back of the napkin math. Other areas of differentiation is, there's a lot of, I think it was John mentioned in COPD, the heterogeneity of patients. You see that in asthma with multiple phenotypes. And, understand we have eosinophils, we have neutrophils, we have pheno, different types of targeted drugs out there from MOA. So I think we want to understand these different patient populations and get into possibly how more targeted therapies work better than not targeted, especially if we want to move beyond, say, inhaler therapy, that where we get to the more severe and advanced patient, and possibly how that plays out in earlier interventions by understanding the certain biomarkers early. Getting a targeted therapy earlier could lead to a better long-term outcome. Which leads me to my last one, as I mentioned earlier, long-term real-world evidence, durability of effect. I agree with the notion that, how can we get earlier enrollment into extension studies or real-world evidence tracking, if you will, in order to get longer-term data when a drug comes to launch. Those are areas that are still lacking and would differentiate from my lens.
Great. We should probably be planning some external control groups where we have like standard of care sort of got to maybe clinical trial level standard sort of quality and data collection, such that we could tap into prospective cohorts that would allow some sort of real world evidence control that we could be confident in without having perhaps save on the size of a trial. I think we're just out of time. We've got 7 minutes left. Let's switch to some operational excellence and give Malcolm a chance to speak up. How do we run these trials on timelines that matter? Obviously, we know trials are hugely costly, and let's just have a quick discussion. 5 minutes to do this, in sort of what slows these studies down and what gets them over the line. Maybe Malcolm, you can kick us off with giving us your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the classic challenge that we always hear is around recruitment and engagement, and I think it speaks to the third point on the poll, reaching kind of representative real-world patient populations and studies and generating the evidence quickly. We found actually that this actually hasn't really been a challenge, and it's something that we excel at Linders Health, both through a combination of using electronic health records that we're able to use coded searches to be able to enable physicians, family doctors to be able to identify potential patients or subjects for trials, and for them to be able to invite them quickly to participate. And they could be outside of traditional sites or urban settings. As we know, within respiratory space, it's particularly competitive, not just within assets and therapeutics, but also for patients themselves and within sites. So we like to take a an approach which could be hybrid, so using a combination of virtual sites as well as physical sites or decentralized, to ensure that we're reaching as quickly as possible a representative audience, and then using a combination of digital marketing for acquisition, which can be very targeted, and AI-assisted kind of EHR records to enable us to be able to identify and recruit patients quickly. So that typically tends to kind of get our trials and studies moving quickly, and then really, that kind of helps to keep the momentum going. Interested to and curious to maybe hear from Joanne, if you've any sort of best practice or experience or examples there which have worked well for you from a sponsor perspective. I know that worked well for me when I was at Alien and GSK, but obviously on the Lindus side, different perspective today.
Yeah, I think you hit on quite a few things that I was thinking, yeah, they're the exact things that work great. So, kind of going back to the esophageal lung study again, the ability, the linked EHR system and being able to find eligible patients and being able to understand their comorbidities, being able to see what their treatments were, their adverse events, having all of that information at your fingertips makes a lot of things go a lot more simply. And I use that as an example because it is something that, I don't often see across, some of the larger CROs, still not using EHR systems as a standard search tool. That's where the patients are, that's where all their information is. I think having that connected end-to-end product and being able to see your data in one place is hugely valuable during a trial. When you have a situation where your data is delivered at the end of the study, that is, I suppose I consider that quite old-fashioned. It's almost like receiving all the paper CRFs again. And I think, being able to have all of those things in the right places is exactly the kind of things that gets studies, on track and gets them running in a timely fashion.
Yeah, and I think we found that the more, subcontractors, sub-vendors there are, the more fragmentation, the more breakdown of data and consistency. If you have one platform, like, for example, with our Citrus platform, so we run trials end to end, so we will manage everything and all of the data that comes with that. It means we have foresight of potential, challenges, and we can get ahead of them to address them before there are issues, which typically means that we're not putting, more people or more hours on a problem. We're trying to deal with something before it actually happens, or deal with it quickly. So yeah, just having that kind of end-to-end oversight and the flexibility operationally to be able to move quickly or address issues is a big differentiator that we've found.
Yeah, and it removes a huge amount of the complexity. It's all those added bits that add to the complexity and opportunities for things to go wrong.
And John Hurst, from a trial, if you're a trial site, what do you see that slows the trials down, and what would get them over the line for you as a clinician?
So there's definitely something about the complexity of the protocol, the frequency of the visits, and so making it as easy for us as clinicians to deliver the study is important. And I think respiratory has some particular complexities with spirometry, with imaging, which is maybe paired in inspiratory, expiratory, need for phantoms, all that kind of thing. And also thinking carefully about the sites that you go to, because often it's not the most famous names. You've got the biggest collection of patients. It may be sites that you don't expect so much. And so doing your intelligence about where has recruited successfully before is likely to be time well spent, I think.
Great. We're actually just about to come top of the hour, so our hour together is finished. I think we wanted to present this as an opening conversation. we've had some questions through the talk. I didn't moderate enough to leave 10-minute questions at the end. But we would love the questions to follow up afterwards. I think perhaps we should plan to congregate again, and whether it's 6 months' time or when we can address more of these issues, so we can improve our ability to get therapeutics that the payers are going to be confidently able to reimburse, such that the access issue is not a problem at the end. So big thank you to all the panelists, to Lindus Health for hosting us and allowing this conversation across the multiple dimensions that we've been able to bring together today. And just leave any of the panelists for any closing remarks.
No, thanks for moderating, John Matthews. Excellent job, and to all of our panelists. If there are any questions that we didn't answer, and I saw there were a few, then obviously please do email us in. Hopefully you can find our contact details via LinkedIn. But yeah, from me, thanks again.
Thank you. I think we should probably plan to have bring the Salford lung study investigators together and do a panelist discussion, so we can learn from that study, because I think it was hugely innovative. And as Joanne said, I don't think it's been repeated again. So we should perhaps look at whether there's some specific examples and have a panel discussion about that topic, maybe in 3 to 6 months' time.
Thanks, everyone.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.